If you are unfamiliar with esports or don't really understand what it is, what you're watching is the absolute pinnacle of esports. That's Jaedong, one of the best Zerg players of all time. He's in the top right of an ace match of the match point, facing off against Stork right there, playing Protoss in the bottom left. Both of these guys are exceptionally talented. Both of these guys are top 10 Starcraft players of all time. Both these guys are top 3 Starcraft players at their specific races of all time. They're two of my favorites ever. They are players capable of doing very aggressive strategies, but in general they are players that really favor more of a macro approach. Now, Stork is a guy who, out of all the top-end Korean pro gamers, is known as probably the slowest guy, actions per minute wise. And Jaedong, the Tyrant, is just an incredibly handsome and talented player who's very fast and very decisive. I would say those are the two things that really stick out to me about Jaedong's play. And whenever you consider Jaedong's play, the thing that really jumps out to you in terms of stylistic and what is unique about him compared to other Zerg players is his ability to micro the Muta, because the Muta is almost synonymous with Jaedong, because if you look at the Muta when it was made by Blizzard wasn't really intended to be a unit that you could micro so heavily. That is one of the things that made StarCraft Brood War perfect, is Blizzard put out this game that wasn't necessarily perfect, but then the pros figured out a few things that made the matchups work. One of them was Mutalisk Micro. And the way that works, if you're brand new to the game, is you can only hotkey so many units in a control group. It's very difficult to get your army from point A to point B in Brood War. It's not like StarCraft 2 where you can have your entire freaking army on one hotkey. And there certainly isn't any control all army hotkey, which is just a joke, as we see a Nexus being put up here for Stork. But what's interesting about the Muta micro is you have to put an Overlord in your Muta control group, and that allows you to sort of stack the Mutas. The idea with Muta micro is you stack the Mutas as though they're one Muta, and then all the Mutas can shoot at once, and it's impossible to focus fire the weak Mutas. Whereas if you didn't have a Overlord in your control group and you weren't microing them correctly, the player, the Protoss or Terran player, or even Zerg player with Scourge, could target down the weak Muta. And that's very, very important to note, because that really changed Terran versus Zerg. Zerg was really dominating Terran in terms of... actually, Terran was really dominating Zerg. I almost knocked something over on my desk when I said that, sorry. Terran was better against Zerg for a long time, and then whenever Zerg figured out how to micro the Muta, it sort of swung back in their direction. And that's something that we see in StarCraft all the time, is a certain race will be dominating a certain matchup or doing really well in a certain matchup, and then someone will come along and figure out something in the matchup and then sway it in a certain direction. And people will sort of copy the certain thing that the player does, as we see a cannon come out here at the natural for Stork. And really what I mean by that is, if you look at the Protoss vs Zerg matchup, which is what we're watching now, it's considered very Zerg favored until a Protoss player named Bisu made up something called the Bisu build, where Protoss would open Corsair, and they would also get DT. Of course, Overlords provide detection for Zerg. Zerg never really make Spore Crawlers in this matchup to blindly protect like they would in StarCraft 2 because of the risk of like Phoenix and Oracle and Void, as well as of course the DT openers, and of course it gives you the ability to spot observers. Well, you can't spring up Spore Crawlers in this game like you can StarCraft 2, so they have way less flexibility. And what's really interesting about the Spore Crawler is that in StarCraft 2 you can move it around and it reroutes really quickly. So it's just become a very common thing for Zerg to make one of them. Well, it wasn't like that in Brood War. What happened was, Zerg would just rely on their Overlords to detect. The Overlords are slow as hell, and they're going to have some in their base. As you see, a Zealot cleaned up, and Lings are continuing to run around the base. And Stork is basically trying not to lose any probes until he gets his first range unit out. This is part of why PvZ is so hard, is Zerg has the ability to get into your base, as you see a Stargate come up here. If Zerg can get into your base, then they can just screw you around with Zerglings and constantly get little probe snipes and just be so loathsomely irritating. Now, if you're 98% of people who've ever played this game, it's really hard to keep those lings alive for like more than 2 minutes. But if you're Jaedong, you have all the APM in the world, and those 2 lings turn into a fucking nightmare. And then it becomes this thing where, okay, I don't want to send my first Dragoon back into my main, because then he's going to try to run more lings in, and Jaedong does run more lings in. So Jaedong was known as a really decisive player, and they're showing the reaction shot of Stork because this is just so incredibly irritating. He's losing probes, and this is part of why Zerg was good in PvZ. I was talking about the history of the metagame as we see a Citadel coming up. So it looks like Stork might be going into some version of the Bisu build. Remember, this game occurred in early 2010, just before Wings of Liberty came out. The beta, at least, the beta of Wings was March of the same year. So this was sort of like one of the last Pro League sessions ever played before there was any splintering of the scene at all. And if you look at the history of Starcraft 2, it was a game that the top level Kespa Koreans were not allowed to switch over to until the first expansion, Heart of the Swarm. Both of these guys, Stork and Jaedong, were not allowed to play Starcraft 2 because Kespa wanted to keep milking them in the Brood War Pro League because everybody in Korea loves the Brood War Pro League, and it was a known like money-making commodity that they didn't want to take a big risk by switching it to Star 2. Some people say like, oh well, why did Starcraft 2 never get as popular as Brood War in the Korean scene? This is a big reason why. Like the OSL and MSL, which was sort of like the GSL for Brood War back in the day, the individual star leagues, they weren't as popular as Pro League. Pro League was the one that was like on TV and watched super consistently, and I think had like more normie appeal, as sort of like it has the team sport angle of like, oh yeah, like we're sending out representatives one at a time. It's sort of like Dragon Ball Z, the way Pro League works. It's like, yeah, we've got a squad here, but like we're not just gonna, do a big shit show like free-for-all and it just be a disaster. We're gonna like 1v1 and honorably send out representatives. And I think like that really appeals to like the male psyche. I think that's like a big reason why like a lot of guys like Dragon Ball Z is it's like they're just gonna like 1v1 and watch their friends. And I think that's part of what makes games like StarCraft so fun, is if you find a friend group who will actually do it with you and not idiotically ask to play like team games instead, then what you can do is you can 1v1 your friends and 4 people can obs and like go into a different channel and like talk about the game and what they think is going to happen and the pros and cons of your game, and then when that one ends, 2 of the people that were obsing get to play, and you get to sort of take turns watching people 1v1. And for the hardcore player who truly enjoys the game and is trying to get better, there's a huge appeal to that as you see a DT coming out and a Corsair running around trying not to die to Scourge. And this is what I was talking about earlier, the Bisu build. This is the thing that changed Protoss versus Zerg and made it a matchup that went from really favoring Zerg to just sort of favoring Zerg. And this really shows how if you're an intelligent god tier level player, you can make up something that will change the game for years to come. This Bisu build thing was not like a gimmick. It wasn't like, oh, he figured out how to do this all in that got him some undeserved wins and people copied on ladder. People are using this years later. People are doing this Bisu build even now to this day. So anytime you can make a significant impact on StarCraft history, it's a big deal. And whenever you do something like inventing Marine splitting, like Marine King did versus Kirex in StarCraft 2 in the second ever GSL, like people obviously still split Marines. Like unless you watched the game from the very beginning, you probably just assumed like people like knew how to split Marines out the box. No, it was something that took them a while to figure out. And whenever you can innovate a core gameplay mechanic, it's huge because it's a lot like baseball, where the sport that has the biggest, most rich history, they play the most games, and the history sort of means the most. Well, if you set a record in baseball, have an all-time record in baseball, that's why it's a bigger deal than the other sports, like sample size and because it has the longest, richest history. Well, StarCraft is really similar, where it's like if you do something for the first time in StarCraft, it's a huge accomplishment because this is the best esport ever and the game that mattered the most and that all of the esports tried to copy. You see these abhorrent joke games like Overwatch that don't have any business pretending to be an esport and have no replay value or watchability value. They're clout chasing and trying to be what StarCraft Brood War was and failing horrifically. Protoss player going to try to push up in this ramp on match point, dropping a few storms on the Hydra. Storm, of course, devastating against Hydras, and Jaedong really needed lurkers at the top of that ramp. He moved most of his lurkers down to that bottom middle base, sort of the tummy section of the mini-map, and now he's swinging the lurkers back over. And that's always a tricky thing if you're trying to play macro Zerg, as we see another droopy storm come down, blanketing the lurkers. If you're trying to play macro Zerg, allocating your lurkers is one of the hardest parts, because once you get sewn up in certain areas, it can be very hard for the Protoss to break you. But we saw Jaedong trying to secure the bottom side of the base, left himself vulnerable, but he did swing the lurkers back over and not take too much damage. Notice he pulled his drones, that's huge. I always loved Stork SimCity, and obviously a lot of the Korean players are going to have great SimCity consistently, but there's something about Stork SimCity after watching his games over the years that I've always found like really clean and appealing. Jaedong surging through the middle of the map here, trying to get lurkers up on the high ground. This has been an exciting back and forth game. And the interesting thing about PvZ is earlier we were talking about sort of the phases of it. Like in the very early game, Zerg will try to get Lings in your base sometimes, and if they do, it's an absolute bitch before you can get goons out. As you see DTs laying waste to the Zerg army, a speed overlord coming over. Remember, the default overlords were the detector. It wasn't like Star 2 where you had to have an overseer. And this is a irritating little thing you have to deal with as Protoss sometimes, where Zerg will put lurkers up on the high ground, and then they can use that sometimes to sort of siege you and bait your army into other fire. And if you don't have a big army, or you get your army wiped, or you miss a macro cycle, it's very, very daunting to break these big fucking lurkers armies that Zerg has. So it's just one thing to note if you're Protoss, like remember, like he doesn't have Reaver tech, and he's getting encroached on with this beautiful lurker placed right on the corner of this ledge. This is perfect micro, and you know, you don't really get to micro that much as Zerg, let's be honest. Starcraft 1 or 2, it's like, oh, like, did I fungal his army? Like, did I get my fucking orange cloud off from my defiler? Like, did I dark swarm? LOL, it's pretty hard to mess that up. Like, think about like microing Roach Hydra against like a Protoss army in Star 2. It's just like, oh, I get force fielded and died. Like, there's not a lot of micro you get to do as Zerg. It's more of a macro race. So as we see Jaedong swinging in here, part of how you micro as Zerg, macro Zerg, is like, I'm going to put my lurkers in this cute abusive spot. Is, oh my god, look at all that blood. As we see why Storm is the bread and butter of this matchup, and it's Protoss' first big power spike in the matchup. Is once Protoss Storm finishes, they're way less vulnerable to Hydra nonsense, and they can really fight with Zerg on the ground. Notice Jaedong diligently splitting his lurkers, but another big devastating blow, bloody paths everywhere, as you know the Protoss is brawling well with the Zerg. When the end of the battle, excuse me, I was gonna make just a grotesque analogy there, but dumped out of it. You know it goes bad for Zerg when you look at the battle floor and it's just covered in blood, you know, so it's just absolutely grotesque for Zerg. Storm is so good. Storm is one of the best things in all of Brood War. Like, I was being sardonic about like Dark Swarm and how good it was earlier. Like, Storm is fucking insane. It's good in every matchup. After you dump your Storms, you can make the Archon, which are incredible versus Zerg. And here's what Jaedong wanted to do earlier. He has hold position lurkers, and right whenever he attacked, the obs came up, so it's not nearly as devastating as it could have been. Because what Jaedong really wanted to do there is just unleash lurkers on the Protoss, and the Protoss be like, oh shit, what's happening, and take a couple volleys. But the obs actually arrived right as the trap was sprung. So that's one of those things where both players are doing the right thing and playing well, and they sort of parry each other despite being intelligent and both of them doing the right thing. That's what it sort of looks like in StarCraft, where even when someone does something cool like that and it works, the other person doesn't just get good game by it necessarily. And in Brood War, it's so mechanically difficult getting your stuff from point A to point B, making the army, making workers, taking bases. It's just very arduous without multiple building select and auto mine, even for these top-end Korean players. So when you lose a big fight like that, it's way harder to end the game if you're the winning player of the fight. It makes it where it's not like Star 2, where it's like, oh, I rolled over him. I rolled over his Roach Hydra army with my Colossus Death Ball like in Wings. I'll just like do another warp gate cycle and A move. Doesn't work like that in Brood War, because even like attacking with your winning army and trying to like route his base and route the upcoming army is hard, like 1A, 2A, 3A. And we see more storms blanketing Jaedong here. Is, my goodness, a bloody massacre like the Alamo occurring here. And Jaedong trying to make a final stand like Jim Bowie, but he'll be forced to retreat like the lone Frenchman. And the Protoss player Stork expanding again in the top left, starting with cannons before Nexus, making it harder to be backstabbed. And Jaedong, with this Overlord up here, would have saw the Nexus and would have been able to click some lings up there. And on match point, that corner base is sort of a pain in the ass to wheel out to defend. So these are the little things that the top end players do. And, you know, someone might say, like, well, shouldn't you take your Nexus first? Like, don't you want it to be mining? This shows that at the top level, look, a pack of lings are coming right on time. And by the way, I've never seen this game even back in the day. And photon cannons start to rain down on the lings, and this is why you open with the cannons, is once the lings get the crackling upgrade, aka the attack speed upgrade that you need hive for. The joke is that they attack so fast it's like they're on crack. That's why they're called cracklings, if you didn't know. The crackling in Brood War is just like insanely powerful, especially with attack upgrades. One of the best things that Zerg can do in this entire matchup is to load a bunch of cracklings into Overlords and just drop mass Zergling in the Protoss main, because remember, there's no warp in. So they kill the building so insanely fast where you can just destroy the Protoss, walk over them basically. It's actually crazy how fast like +3 cracklings can ravage a Protoss main. And you know, if their main base is out on the map, they don't have idiotic Nexus recall or Mothership Core recall. They have Arbiter recall, but remember, that's more of an offensive spell that you have to actively tech up towards. It's not the end-all, be-all, bail me out of the game at all times horseshit that we see in Star 2. And I think that if you look at Starcraft 2 now and you look at these old classic Brood War games, man, these old classic Brood War games really beat the shit out of them viewing-wise. They're so much more fun to watch and so much more skillful. These guys are having to do so fucking much, and they have to play so well as we see more storms coming down, as Jaedong is having his army butchered again here. Stork is taking an incredible amount of the map. Remember, the Dong flooded up into the top left and canceled that Nexus, but ultimately that was a small victory. And he's trying to run up top left again. Notice that Stork has some army over there, as well as a High Templar. And I love the sort of like 90s like Pokemon-esque sprite we see in the bottom middle of that High Templar. And the Zealots, unfortunately for Stork, are going to move away right as the attack occurs. Part of why these Brood War games rock so much, as you see a whole mineral line worth of probes being ravaged, is all these games were occurring on land. So you knew none of these guys were ever cheating, and they played on 0 ping. That's just a little thing that like a lot of people who have grown up and only been following esports for the last few years don't really realize how big of a deal that is. Big storm goes down, butchering the Ling counterattack. More cannons come up, and this is one of those things where you know that this base is going to get spam attacked, so you make a lot of static defense. Remember, a lot of newbies over-rely on static defense. Like, think about like your average like bronze or silver player might think like, alright, I'm going to take my natural and make like 10 cannons at the front door of the natural. Well, like obviously then like your opponent can just circumvent the cannons, or see you're doing that and expand a lot themselves and get ahead economically. And they know they can't be attacked because your money is all in cannons. As you see the spawning pool die there, which is a big pain in the ass, and the Defiler Mound too, which is even worse. So a devastating blow for the Dong. As, oh man, that's just crazy, as we see a counter drop occurring as Lings flood up into the main to try to stop the Zealots, and it's Lurkers and Defilers too. Double Darkstorm coming down, as I freaking love Brood Wars so much. It's like a movie unfolding in front of our eyes, as the Lings were not able to deflect the Zealots. The Zealots still ravaging the main, as this is like when both fighters are just going for nothing but offense in a fist fight and not defending at all and just blasting each other in the face. It's devastating damage occurring in the Zerg main. multiple buildings that were needed to do the basics of macro being killed. Remember, right now, Jaedong can't make Defilers or Zerglings. Pretty heckin' important in a freaking Starcraft ZVP late game, don't you think? And we can see the nice little FPVOD, Jaedong trying to get some Defiler energy on the Defilers that he does have left. Notice that he's started to remake, so that's nice. I haven't seen the spawning pool yet, and we see an FPVOD of Stork here. This is another thing that I really like, was the use of FPVODs. I remember at my favorite LAN I ever went to, MLG Dallas 2013. That was when HOTS came out, and these guys like Jaedong and Bisu and these gods came over to America for the first time to play Star 2. And that LAN, it was absolutely incredible, and I just love that one so much. As we see the Protoss army around the middle of the map here trying to encroach upon the Zerg, and the Zerg wants to get a big plague down but fails, and another big drop, a storm occurring in the main, and a bunch of cannons are up because Stork expected this, and he opened with the Bisu build, and he's showing the multitask of Bisu here, trying to defend, but double Darkstorm in the main is just so insanely ridiculous to deal with. Darkstorm is one of those spells where it's sort of like, well, you use it defensively when people are pushing you, and it's like, well, if you can get up way up in their face and get a big dark swarm down, it's freaking crazy how like irritating it is. Huge storms massacring the lurkers, and this is one of those things where Stork having to defend his main, having to defend the middle of the map, as storms raining all over the parade of Jaedong, as blood all over the floor of the map. Like it's that song, Blood Up on the Stage, bonded by blood, and that's how the Protoss feels right now. They're bonded together, butchering the Zerg from all 360 degrees, and it's an exodus of the Zerg as the god-tier Korean Stork surges eastbound, continuing to defend the encroaching attacks of the Zerg, but with more Defilers coming up, Zealots screaming into the northbound. It looks like Stork might need to collect himself a little bit. The Zealot counterattack threatening, but remember the Lurkers are sort of the bread and butter of the Zerg army. Yeah, it's like really all about the Defiler and the spells, but like Jaedong's going to land the spells. The reason that the Protoss Stork can't just run up and like monster mode through and do whatever he wants is really because of the Lurkers. Like that's why he can't just run in with all those Zealots and get the map control. And when the Darkstorm's on top of the Lurkers, man, that's a pain in the ass. Remember though, Protoss can use Zealots, so if it's only a couple Lurkers, that's no big deal. Now remember, Terran doesn't really have range units, like the best they can do is Fire Bats and use the secondary splash. So that's why ZVP is a little bit easier for Protoss than it is Terran as far as like the interaction with the Defiler. And remember that the units of Protoss have shields, which makes the Dark Swarm, the Defiler Plague rather less good. Whereas like Terran really gets it like worse from the Defiler, and the Ultra's really good against Terran too, which is part of what makes the matchup hard. So we notice that Stork understands where the bases that are going to be highly contested are, and he's not afraid to build a bunch of cannons there. So like that's one thing I'll say to new players. If you know that like this macro game is going to come down to whether you hold this fourth, and you know he has an Overlord over the fourth, and he's going to run Lings up there, don't be afraid to make a plethora of cannons and leave Lings up there as the Lurkers come down and immediately get blanketed by Storm. And we can see how fast Jaedong looked away from the fight. We know how decisive these Korean pro gamers are. I know a lot of you guys at home would have fucked that whole fight and waited for like the Fog of War to reappear after being like, oh wow, everything died. Like Jaedong saw that storm, like saw 2 frames of it and like immediately went back to consuming Lings with his Defilers. Like people talk about how fast Jaedong is, and what an incredible player he was to watch and how decisive he is, and all of that's true, but it's just so nice to see it come forward in his game so visibly, as a big droopy Zerg drop is going to occur at the 12 o'clock onto that plethora of cannons, and oh my god, big storms on the Overlord, and the Dark Swarm gets off, as this is absolutely gory. And the thing about Dark Swarm is it makes a lot of those cannons impotent. Now the cannons are firing, but they're not doing as much as you think. But fortunately for Stork, the God tier storms just blanketed the Overlords and really gutted that drop. And we can see with the use of the Zealots that really nullifies what can make the Dark Swarm absurdly annoying. which is like when you're Terran and they get anything under that Dark Swarm in your main, and it's like, oh, I just can't retake my base. With Zealots, it's not so bad as long as there's not a bunch of stuff under there. And then it's not really so much about the Dark Swarm. This has been a great back and forth game, and this is what makes Brood War so great, as it's so incredibly difficult to macro that it makes it way more difficult to just end the game off of one big engagement, which is a problem that we saw in Starcraft 2 frequently. People were complaining about for years, even back in Wings with the slower ramp up, where it was like, you lose one big fight and it's over. Think about how many big fights these guys have had. This has been like a damn boxing match. These guys have been doing nothing but having big fights. And we can see a plethora of +3 Archons here, and Archons are so good against Zerg. Big Droopy Plague going down. Size Storms and the Dark Swarms being exchanged there, and I'll be honest with you guys, the thing about Size Storm is it's really good when you're retreating, and the Dark Swarm is more of like a static spell where it's more about zone control, and that's really where the Plague comes in, is you get zone control and then you run up and plague them. The way that I feel about this matchup on like a sort of like a newbie casual sense is like, it feels like the tools that Zerg have were more tailored to beating Tyrant. Like when I think about the Defiler and the Ultra, like Zerg's biggest tier 3 weapons, they're definitely better against Tyrant. And it feels like it can be way harder to close out a really good talented macro Protoss than it is like a Terran player trying to go SK Terran. Storms are blanketing the Ultras here, but the Ultra, remember, it's just so insanely tanky. Jaedong has the 5 armor upgrade, and Hydras are very slow and immobile, as we see Ultras crushing down on the Archons with Storms being used. So when you can get the Ultras, the Ultra doesn't really do that much damage to the big beefy Protoss army, but what the Ultra does is it doesn't just die to Storm. And we can see one thing that Stork hasn't done this game is make any Reavers. And sometimes in late game ZVP we'll see Toss like add some Reavers because it can make it harder to backstab bases. But with all the cannons that Stork has up, his bases are pretty damn safe. And I know I've been talking about the cannons a lot this game, and I love this freaking High Templar that got dropped off back here like waiting for freaking Storm energy, trying to like storm 20 drones. Storm drop is another thing, by the way, that is just like insanely good for Toss. And I talked about earlier, like, oh, Size Storm's so good, it's like good in all the matchups. Like, remember, you can also load those MFs up in a shuttle and just drop them behind a mineral line and clear someone's whole damn mineral line. And like, when we think about a Reaver drop, it's way more finicky, and I don't want to say gimmicky because it's not, but it's just more difficult to control in macro, a Reaver drop. Whereas like a Storm drop, like you fly in and oh my god, if they're not ready right then, there goes the mineral line. Another big drop occurring for Jaedong, as a lot of times whenever Protoss players get hit with that first big drop, that's sort of the thing that defines the game, and Jaedong's done multiple big drops on Stork, and Stork's been doing a great job of defending. But again, without Warp Gate, this is way harder than just warping in some DT Zealot and recalling your army. You have to wheel your whole freaking main army back. And remember, there's limited control group size, so getting your stuff from point A to point B is not easy. Plus, goons are pretty fucking stupid, and they're sort of buggy, so getting them to move properly can be arduous. Lots of Ultras out here for the Dong. Zealot Archon screaming eastbound, and big Storms on the Ultras, the Lurkers beneath them being eviscerated by the Storms, and more Storms occurring, absolutely blanketing the Ultras. But there are so many Ultras that have such a high amount of HP that they just run awash over the Protoss army, and the Protoss army devastated. And really the crux of the issue was the drop in the main. Stork had to allocate the army that he needed to win that fight to defend the main. He was having to worry about rebuilding buildings. And a lot of times whenever we think about StarCraft 2 and Brood War, Zerg is the race that has the least options to harass in terms of, think about Toss, Storm drop, DT drop, the Reaver, you know, I can go on and on. Corsair, think about Terran with like the dropship and like the medevac, which no one ever gives enough credit how good the medevac is in Stark 2. It's a legitimate S-class unit, as you might see a Storm drop here occur. And there's not that many drones, and oh wow, he clipped some of the ones on the back end off the hizzy. That's like that professor move off the hizzy where he bounced it off his head. he freaking dropped High Templars behind his mineral line and then stormed transferring ones that were behind a wall. Just a very bizarre thing that you would like never see. And I love how he got the main mineral line too. This is a funny thing that I'm sure has happened to everyone who's even played a little Brood War, where Stork has sort of like walled himself in, and he was trying to get an Archon out and couldn't, and now he's being attacked in that spot. And there's this funny thing where if you're Protoss, obviously you don't want this base to die, you don't want to take any damage, but you're sort of like, yeah, please don't kill my gateway, lol, I definitely don't want that gateway to die so I can get out. And then you see all that Zerg army show up and you're like, actually I think I want that gateway there. In fact, give me a couple of 3 gateways. And this is one of the things that you have to struggle with if you're Zerg, where you really want to crack these bases that can be in choke points or SimCity'd off. And it's very difficult to ram your way in, even with a lot of ultras, if the other player has the proper tools, DTs, spellcasters, etc. So we see Jaedong doing what a lot of Zerg players do, where it's like, I'm just going to throw a bunch of Dark Swarm in and try to run it down his throat. And that's why drop is so effective. And he can't really drop this base because it's literally covered in cannons and 360 degrees and High Templars everywhere. And he's just trying to freaking Rambo down the Nexus, and he does. And that's a devastating blow for Stork, as the Dong encroaching upon the Archons. As we saw this base that Stork cared about so much, and he needed it so badly to win the game. And he defended it. He defended this really weird, talented drop Jaedong did that came in from a weird angle and had Defiler Lurker. He stormed the shit out of it, and he did such a good job defending that base, but ultimately it was the backstab drops of Jaedong in the main that won him this game. He diverted just enough of Stork's army away from the main part of the map, the middle of the map where they had been brawling so much, to win that big engagement that ended up being the game-defining engagement, rotting out Stork's main, making him waste time and money remaking stuff like gateways and a cybernetics core. Jaedong really proved that one of the most important, powerful things you can do as Zerg in this matchup is sitting there and doing drops with cracklings. Also worth noting, he freaking loaded up Defilers and Lurkers in the drops, which I was talking about crackling drops and how fast they kill stuff, but it makes it way more complicated to retake your main when you have to account for Dark Swarm and Lurkers. Because you don't really SimCity your main to be able to like retake it. In other words, like you can have to run through a big choke to get up your own, end up into your own main ramp, and you know what? If they have Lurkers like and Dark Swarm, like good luck getting back up in there. As you see, there's officially nothing left of the 12 o'clock, like the Angel season. And the Dong definitely ahead here. And this is the thing about Zerg, where the Protoss army can still be very strong in a big ball, and if they get great storms off can be devastating still, but you're sort of eclectically spread across the map here if you're Jaedong. You've got a little smidgen of army here, you got some Lurkers here. That's part of what's so endearing and charming about Brood War Zerg that we don't really see from Starcraft 2 Zerg, where like Brood War Zerg, pardon like the weirdness of the expression, but like it feels Zergy, right? Like it's about massing, and like if you look at the supplies of a Brood War game, which I know with this UI we can't really, but like as you see, oh my god, a freaking Defiler drop, and he freaking plagued his whole army with the Defiler drop. I've never seen that. That's insane. But Ultraling is going to be pushed back here, and this is what I was talking about, where when the toss has like this much, it can be scary if you're not all together. Jaedong getting a storm down, grabbing his Lurkers, and he's got some Lurkers spread here, some Lurkers spread there, the Defiler to base to defend, some Lings by the Defilers, and this is how Zerg's supposed to be played. You're not supposed to have 30 Roaches and 20 Hydras and 10 Ravagers all in one hotkey. Like, that's not how Zerg's supposed to be played. Like, that's freaking corny. Like, you watch this Brood War game, and it's like, yeah, the graphics might be bad, but like, it feels like the best RTS when you watch it. And when you consider how difficult it is in terms of the hotkey and the multiple building select restrictions, it's fucking insane as the Dark Storm dissipates and Jaedong runs away from a half dozen Archons and some Zealots. And this is a little scary if you're Jaedong, because you're not necessarily mining that much this long into a game on a map like Match Point, where there's not a million bases. It's not a map like Varamir where you can just keep expanding. Jaedong's almost mined out of that base. Stork almost mined out. And when you think about games like this, oh my god, he gets a DT and there's no detection. A devastating mistake from the Dong. He loses an Ultra and the Defiler. Notice an OBS there from Stork too. It's always very, very good to have OBS everywhere. And unfortunately, you can't really see. One of the only things that the quality truly takes away from, I think, is like you can't see the OBS everywhere on the map super clearly. To me, like, I can still enjoy the game. Like, I still think the game looks good enough to enjoy. It's not like, anyway. The Lurker's coming into this base and denying it. This is the infamous 12 o'clock base that was sort of the big contingency point of the game. And Jaedong is doing something brilliant here that I haven't really seen, where he's using the Overlord more like a dropship in the sense that, like, he's doing hot pickup micro. He is dropping lurkers and he's dropping defilers and doing quick plagues. He's doing obnoxious little lurker drops where he picks up and sets up somewhere else. Usually the drops that I see are just like, screw it, I'm going to get 10 overlords, put everything in him and drop his main. And we see Jaedong looking a little disappointed here as he wasn't able to crack that 12 o'clock base. And this is an absurdly difficult game to cast without a production tab, a unit tab, a supply counter, or a money counter. Because right now it's sort of like both of them are on death's door. Like literally long distance mining, don't have active bases, so presumably less than 400 minerals. And Jaedong's over there grimacing about losing 2 lurkers. So like both of these cats probably at like sub 80 supply and are barely mining. And this is one of the tricky things about Brood War, is you can't just hit control an army. So when you have your army like eclectically spread out over the map in a weird macro game like this, you might have a couple defilers and an overlord still, or like a couple lurkers and an overlord, as Jaedong finally mines out, and he knows, well shit, oh my god, as he's just he's sweating like Shaq at the free throw line, wants to win so bad, and he's just giving it everything that he has. But unfortunately for him, the Tyrant has run out of map, and he's in this weird position where, this is what I was talking about earlier, where it can be hard to finish first Protoss, where Jaedong, he can sort of defend in certain areas and not get run over, but he can't necessarily ever like go up and contest that 12 o'clock. And this is what's happening right now, as the superior army of the Protoss crashing into the Dark Swarm and decimating the Zerg army. Jaedong throws his head back. He knows that Stork has basically nothing left. He knows that this standing army, this handful of Archons, is just about all that Stork has. And is Stork mining? I mean, he's long distance mining. He's barely mining. He barely has a pulse. More of a pulse than Jaedong, who I think is just barely mining a little bit of gas. And this is the big difference, I think, between ZVP and TVP. The Zerg versus Protoss and Zerg versus Terran matchups, is that, as we see drones getting butchered there, is when I think about like how the Defiler works, as we see Jaedong, knowing that it's over, and I think about the Defiler and I just think to myself, like, if that was versus Terran, like that last fight where he threw that Dark Swarm down, like Terran would have had to retreat. If you like watch any Terran streamers, like Dan Artosis, or you watch old VODs like this, you're a fan of the VenomousStare channel, you know that, like, okay, well, when that Dark Swarm goes down, even if you're playing SK Terran or Mech, a lot of the times it's like, retreat, you gotta retreat. But with Toss, since you have the Zealot and you have Storm and the Archon secondary splash, the Swarm is not the end-all be-all. And we saw there when both guys were at the absolute limit, when both of them were completely mined out, they had gone back and forth and played this epic ace match game, and Jaedong GG's, the Dark Swarm was not enough to hold off this tiny little army, where both the guys just put everything they had left out there and emptied the tank, and Stork is overjoyed. The Tyrant went down in a pool of his own sweat, giving everything he had for his boys, and it came down to a god-tier macro game between two legitimate Bonjour level players, and Jaedong devastated. And I love love to see true emotion on players' faces, and you can see the sweat dripping off of him, giving it everything that he had. The Tyrant, like Mark Pryor in Game 6 of the 2003 NLCS, goes down in a blaze of glory for his team, and Stork, showered in the adoration of his teammates, forced to face off against the Tyrant in the ace match of the Pro League. And think about the bus rides home, two very different vibes. And I just absolutely love that game. Not only was it back and forth of two god-tier people constantly freaking fighting, but it came down to the map being mined out and two tiny little armies squaring off, and Jaedong fighting on a Dark Swarm but not being able to hold. And sub for more, guys. Sub for more.